and welcome to Incura's 2022 webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Rashonda Harris, your facilitator for today's webinar on educational bias and opportunities in the workforce. Our esteemed guests joining me for today's webinar are Dr. Jamail Carter, Acting Vice President of Student Services for Los Angeles Southwest College, and Kairi Williams, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research, Administration and Compliance at the University of California, Berkeley. For today's programming, we will be discussing recruiting for students, faculty, and staff, requirements versus preferred, and credentialing biases. Let's get started, Jamail.
Welcome and greetings, everyone. I would like to acknowledge the others on the panel today, Rashonda Harris and Kairi. As she has stated, I am the Acting Vice President of Student Services at Los Angeles Southwest College, or what I like to call South Best, where we have the distinction of being both a predominantly Black institution and a Hispanic serving institution as designated by the Department of Education. We're the fastest growing institution within the Los Angeles Community College District, the largest community college system within California, serving over 100,000 students annually. At Los Angeles Southwest College, we're currently experiencing increases in credit enrollments of 14.6% year over year. We're experiencing increases in African American male enrollment of 13.5% year over year, and increases in Hispanic male enrollment of 7% year over year. Great things are happening in South Los Angeles. There's a world-class learning environment being offered in South Los Angeles at the intersection of Western and Imperial, which is driven by passionate and dedicated student-centered faculty, innovative programs and curriculums, a growing athletics program, and dedicated staff and administrators committed to preparing students for a successful career and economic mobility. While I am the Acting Vice President of Student Services at Los Angeles Southwest College, please note the views expressed on today are those of my own. And so I'm bringing to this discussion, for those of you who do not know, I'm a well-equipped higher education executive with an earned Doctor of Philosophy and non-terminal Masters of Science, and a Master's of Business Administration. And so I'm bringing over 2 decades of experience in higher education, serving in both faculty and administrative positions, having worked in academic affairs, student services, human resources, institutional effectiveness, career education, and workforce development. As a trained industrial organizational psychologist, I'm passionate about aiding organizations in aligning their most valuable assets, their people, to both their long-term and short-term strategy. And so this is both the frame and lens in which I operate from in our discussion today. You can feel free to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Dr. JD Carter. That is the @ DRJD Carter, CARTER. And you can follow me on LinkedIn at Jamail D. Carter, MBA, MS, PhD. And if you have email, if I'm unable to get to your questions, my email address is carterjd2@lasc.edu. So now we'll get started with this portion of my presentation, or our presentation, looking at recruiting for students, faculty, and staff. If we can go to the next slide.
Right now, everyone should be seeing a question in front of you. If you would make your selection. After your selection, we will move forward and continue on with the presentation. Dr. Carter?
Okay, thank you. And it's good to see we have some hiring officials, and we have the majority indicating that you're not a hiring official, but this information will work for everyone, because at some point, you will all be hiring officials. If we can go to the next slide. So when we look at recruitment, one of the things we know, scholarly research and various media outlets have documented the importance of human capital to organizational performance. Recruitment is the process by which human capital is drawn to an organization. Recruitment can have a significant impact on applicant quality, which can lead to significant productivity advantages for your organization. And so we're defining recruitment as a set of organizational activities and practices that are intended to attract people to an organization. It can be students, it can be faculty, it can be staff and or volunteers. What we'll find going to our next slide, goals of recruitment, there are really three basic goals to the recruitment process. You really want to generate a pool of applicants who are qualified for employment or admissions within your institution. And you want to attract people that will accept employment or admissions and who will succeed on the job or in their program of study. So the goals of recruitment are qualified, accept, and succeed in the role. And so when we look at recruitment outcomes, if we go to the next slide, recruitment can be measured by both pre-hire outcomes as well as post-hire outcomes. And so when we're looking at pre-hire outcomes, we're talking about quantity. How large is the candidate pool? Did the high-profile candidates within your discipline or industry show interest? Why or why not? Those are some of the questions you want to ask yourself when you're looking at the quantity of applicants within your pool. And then we look at quality. How would you rate the knowledge, skills, and abilities of those that have applied for the position? Diversity is also a pre-hire outcome, and it's how diverse is your pool? Did applicants from various walks of life apply for the position? If there's a lack of diversity, that may show that there's something wrong with your recruitment strategies. Examples of post-hire recruitment outcomes are performance. Was the individual the superstar you thought you were hiring when you brought them aboard? And then retention, how long did your hire stay in the role? Many times we spend tons of money recruiting for positions only for individuals to leave quickly within the first year, 2 years, 3 years. And part of that is a result of a poor fit between what we may have been promoting as an institution with what the applicant or the employee thought they were stepping into.
Dr. Carter,
yes.
may I ask, while you are on this slide, could you go into defining the hiring official before we go to the next slide?
Yeah, so a hiring official will be someone who has the ability to select an individual for a position. So you can serve on a committee, but just because you're serving on the committee does not make you the hiring official. The hiring official would be the person whom that position would report to, or the person that has the ultimate decision-making authority on whether or not a person is hired for the institution and or that department or discipline.
Thank you.
So when we look at sources for recruiting, there are two types of sources. We have what we call formal sources of recruiting, and then we have informal sources of recruiting. When you're looking at formal sources of recruiting, these are sources in which a third party is used, such as a search firm, a newspaper or trade journal, an online advertisement. And then you have informal searches, which are direct contact between a potential employee and employer. Examples include referrals from employees that are currently with the organization, or a former employee, or maybe a retiree. A significant body of research on recruitment sources and effects it has accumulated over the years. And one of the most consistent findings of this research is that informal sources, these are referrals in particular, tend to have positive effects on post-hire outcome. Specifically, individuals who are hired by means of referrals from existing employees tend to have greater longevity in their position than those who are hired from other sources. Several studies have also found when it comes to recruitment sources by gender and by race and ethnicity, white males are more likely to use informal recruitment sources than that of women or people of color. So therefore, if an institution or organization is relying heavily on informal recruitment, you may be hindering your ability long-term to diversify your workplace. In terms of online recruitment, due to the digital divide in access to computers by race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, it has been suggested that this can also be a source where there are implications for negative impacts on diversity. But there is some mixed research and data behind that, because there are some studies that have indicated that online recruiting tends to yield more diversity within an applicant pool, as opposed to just informal recruiting alone. So when we're looking at an ideal recruiter, the ideal recruiter is someone who is warm and informative. They're able to provide a realistic job preview, disclosing both positive and negative aspects of the position. The recruiter's gender, age, experience, and functional area were found to have significant effects on applicant attraction in some studies. Likewise, the degree of the demographic familiarity or similarity between the recruiter and the applicant was found to have an impact in some studies. So if you desire a more diverse organization, your recruitment team should be diverse. If your recruitment team is not diverse, chances are you're going to have an employee pool or an organization that is very homogeneous. Looking at hiring decisions, there are various heuristics and biases that come into play when we're looking at making decisions about whom we're going to hire. The first one, looking at anchoring and adjustment, it's an initial estimate of value, or anchor can have an undue influence on final judgment or predictions, as adjustment is often insignificant. To give you an example, many employees or employers will ask what an individual's current salary is, and based on one's current salary, that's where they will slide them in on their salary schedule. One of the things that I can say, I'm happy that many states are now banning the process of employers from asking employees their current salary, because this has led to some cases of pay equity in some regions of our nation. And also, when we're looking at, high status job titles, can also lead to higher job evaluations if we're going through the recruitment process. So if you're looking for a president, chances are those on a committee are more likely to invite someone to interview who has served as a VP before they'll invite someone that may be a dean. And so that's an example of an anchor that has been set that can bias those that are invited to interview. Availability. This heuristic is the perceived likelihood or frequency of an event is based on how easily instances come to mind through either recall or imagination. We see this in the work setting when it comes to performance evaluations. If you're doing a poor job of tracking someone's performance over the whole year, and you're just relying on memory, chances are your perception of the performance of that individual is going to be limited to what may have occurred within the last 3 months as opposed to the whole year. Representative, yes.
I have a question while you are here. In terms of these items that we're looking at right now and their biases, how do these affect the educational background of the people that you're recruiting, in terms of when you're recruiting the difference of students or faculty or staff?
So yeah, so I think if you're looking at confirmation bias, that can look at when you're having someone interview, based on where they went, their institution, you can say, well, they went to SC, they went to Stanford, more than likely they're going to be a top candidate, and you're not looking at the red flags that may show up in the interview. So that's one example. If you're looking at framing for how certain things are worded, that can lend itself to someone who may have called themselves, let's say, a domestic engineer, that framing of that word can mean a lot more to other people. If you're looking at a decoy or a phantom effects, this is one of the things I will say. If you are a hiring manager who is sitting on just one level of interviews, you want to be aware that sometimes you can have search committees that will send you 2 candidates, and one candidate, maybe you request that you want, let's say 3 finalists to come before you. You can have, in some cases, committees will send poorer candidates up because there's one candidate they want you to hire, and there may have been more qualified candidates or individuals that could have done the job maybe on equal footing with the candidate whom they sent up with the decoys, because they were afraid if they sent someone else up, as opposed to the 2 decoys with their preferred candidate, that you may have hired that individual. So those are ways in which biases and heuristics can come into the hiring process and skew the whole thing for hiring managers and organizations that are really looking to develop a strong pool of qualified applicants and or employees long term.
Thank you so much. And we have an additional question, and it is, what is the best practice for tracking performance throughout the year rather than during the evaluation recent performance?
So one of the things that I tend to do and I recommend is that you have weekly meetings and you're tracking progress on reports. So if you're having that initial meeting at the beginning of the year where you're evaluating last year, you should outline goals for each employee in terms of what they have to hit. And so if you're tracking their progress, understanding their projects, and every week or month, you're documenting, you're writing the evaluation as you go. When you get to the end, the employee should already know how they're performing. It should not be a surprise that, things have went haywire on them.
That is great feedback. I have another question. How do you mitigate decoy and phantom effects, and can you explain it?
So a phantom effect, an example of that one will be, you're only sending 2 applicants. One is very strong. They went to another employer because your process was so low. So now there's that phantom candidate that the hiring manager never got to see because the process dragged. And so one of the things I think a lot of organizations and institutions fail to realize is that you're in a war for talent. Quality applicants are going to be scooped up as quickly as they can. So if your process is taking months on end, chances are the top candidates are going to land a job before your process concludes if you're moving slow. And so I would say if you're a hiring manager, it's great to get a sense of the makeup of the whole pool of candidates that were interviewed in the first round, including their resumes, any notes for feedback in which the committee has sent your way. And, then you can say, you know what, I may want to pull someone to interview whom the committee did not forward to me, because chances are, if there are people on the committee that have a bias, a lot of quality applicants aren't making it to hiring managers.
That is great feedback. Thank you so much. Would you like to move on to selection strategies? Or is
yes, we can go to selection strategies. So when we're looking at selection strategies, there are 4 that I want to cover. The first one is multiple hurdles, and this is a selection procedure are administered in a sequential order, and so at each sequence there is a score, and those who pass that high score are forwarded further in the sequence. Those that are not are essentially cut and let go. So if you're looking at those who apply, you may have a screening committee that looks at the resumes and the cover letters, and from the list of candidates that have applied, they'll invite someone into a first level interview based on the rankings at the first level interview. Then they'll send someone into a final interview where the hiring authority will then interview and make a determination. That person can use a cut score based on the performance of the candidates, or they can use what we call that judgment method, which is at the end, is really making a selection decision that is not based on a cut score to make an automatic decision. It's really they're relying on their gut or their intuition concerning the feel of the candidate. Then you have compensatory scoring, which is when you're giving everyone the same aspect. So you'll have the candidates all go through maybe both levels of interview, and from there, when you're looking at the scoring, each person is then provided a composite score, and a decision is made based on the cut score of the composites. And then when we're looking at cut scores, it's really setting a level of proficiency that's needed in order to move forward, be it to being selected as the candidate or moving forward within the process if you're doing multiple hurdles. So these are some selection strategies that various organizations are using when they're selecting candidates. We can go to the next slide. So I wanted to talk about diversity in the workplace and when it happens and how it impacts when we're looking at hiring decisions. One of the things we have to understand is that diversity can be both visible or non-visible. Examples of visible diversity is age, gender, and ethnicity. When we're looking at non-verbal diversity, that's education. That's tenure within the organization or within the industry. Socioeconomic background, personality, and political affiliation are all examples of non-visible diversity within the workplace. Diversity in the workplace can be both a liability as well as an asset. And so when we look at benefits of diversity, when you have more people at the table from diverse perspectives, it increases the quality of your decision and also increases the cognitive and informational resources that are available at the table. You're less likely to get groupthink when you have diverse individuals sitting at the table where decisions are being made, and that can enhance the creativity of your organization. But likewise, there are also consequences to diversity where you'll have closed communication. And what we mean by that is that, you know, birds of a feather flock together is probably something you have heard. And so you will find that you will have pockets or isms or schisms within your organization where people are going to be drawn to people that are like them. And so you're not going to see communication spread throughout the organization because it's going to be consecrated or concentrated in various groups. And then also when you're looking at diversity, there can also lead to less group cohesion, which can lead to absenteeism and turnover and conflict. You know, we talk about diverse hires, and diverse hires is a wonderful thing, but if you're bringing in someone into a team or group in which they are a token, for lack of a better phrase, their chances of sticking it out are less likely because you're not building the systems or the structures that they're going to need to be successful in the role. And if you're consistently having a revolving door of turnover, that can also feed itself into some of the previous biases and heuristics that we were discussing. Next slide. Yes.
Before we move forward, you mentioned groupthink. Can you talk about groupthink and how that impacts the diversity that you mentioned?
Yeah, so when we're looking at groupthink, it's essentially where people, because of their shared experience, they're not willing to allow their ideas to be challenged. So if you have individuals who may be younger, who may be a little bit more creative or innovative in terms of how to approach things, maybe it's like, do we really need to have something signed with a pen? We all went through the pandemic, so now we know that we have things that can be signed virtually, where a lot of organizations have adapted that. But you know, you had a lot of younger people that were asking for those types of processes earlier because they saw the benefit in other aspects of business. And so I think when we're in bureaucratic organizations, that where we tend to reward people based on their tenure within an organization, you know, we're less likely to see the creative aspects that can come about when we bring diversity to the table. And so I can say, as a leader, one of the things that I do when I step into a new role is that I have one-on-one interviews with everyone, from managers to, student workers, because some of the most creative ideas that an institution can receive can come from a student worker who has the creativity as to, there's a better way in which this can be done. And so groupthink, I think, prevents productivity. It prevents organizations from really thriving and becoming the organizations they are capable of becoming, because you have everyone singing from the same sheet of music, and they're singing the same old hymnal because they're not wanting to add any bass, any drums, any organ and things of that nature. And so when you're bringing in a diverse workforce, it allows for a more eclectic selection of music.
Thank you so much. Next slide. So
the Equity Pay Act of 1963 was written and signed into law as intended to prevent sex discrimination when it comes to wages. It's part of the larger architecture of fairness in wages known as the Fair Labor Standards Act. We have laws on the books, but for some reason, we seem to see that there's still inequity in pay for women and for people of color. And so this is something that we do see politicians come out and, they're campaigning for us to overcome this barrier and this issue that seems to persist and has persisted for quite some time. There are some strategies, if we can go to the next slide, that Du Bois and Coella have recognized in terms of ways in which an organization can audit their pay of employees. And so when you look at the equal pay analysis, it's an examination of the relative pay for all the men employees against women in similar jobs. So that is one way in which organizations can audit and see if there is inequity going on in their organization. Then we have the pay equity audit, which is an examination of comparable worth using either internal worth, so that's job evaluations or within an organization, or you can go explore external worth, which is comparing how you're paying your employees with similar organizations where people are doing the same work. And with an emphasis predominantly on women or people of color as opposed to those that may be held by predominantly white males. And then across the board audit is a more detailed analysis of the compensation rates of men and women within the organization, with an emphasis on identifying any factors that might lead to observed difference. So why is it that certain people are making less? Is there something that we can identify as to why this is occurring within our organization? The thing that I think is important when we're looking at pay equity, and then when you start looking at equity theory and the impact on morale, if you have individuals that are making high amounts of money, but they're not putting in the work as a lot of the frontline people who may be making less than they're making, this then leads itself to poor morale, but it also can lend itself to people quiet quitting. And I'm sure a lot of us have heard about the craze of quiet quitting that's going on, where people are going to work, but they're not putting in the effort. Part of this can be linked to what we're seeing with inequities in pay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carter. I have a question for you. What will it take for institutions to include disabilities, different abilities, which as a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as these are invisible oftentimes?
Yes, that is correct. And those are things that I think there are organizations that do support, especially when you're looking at students, when you're looking at staff. It is something that is there. I also think what's also critical when we're looking at laws, there are laws when you're looking at ADA that is ensuring that employers take those things seriously. So there are tons of laws on the books, and those are invisible diversity issues. So I do think there are organizations that do take it seriously. And, so I believe on the slide, we did not have disability or diverse abilities on there, but yeah, that is an invisible diverse issue that organizations should make sure that they're prepared to address, so all feel welcome within their organization.
So how exactly will they begin? What will it take for them to begin to address it? Do you think that there needs to be an increase in visibility, or what do you think will actually get their attention in terms of addressing the situation?
I think it's lobbying. I think when we look at any group that has been disenfranchised, is really people going to decision makers and making noise as to this is a group of individuals whom are, not being supported, and identifying allies that would join the fight alongside you and your team, excuse me, to make sure that comes to the forefront when it comes to hiring decisions and admissions decisions at our institutions. Because if we do not advocate, it's easy, they talk about the noisy wheel gets the oil, then those resources that should go to individuals with diverse abilities will go elsewhere. And that's a sad state of affairs, but when you're looking at the allocation of resources, it appears that many institutions tend to give the resources to the groups that are making the most noise. And that's problematic, but it is something that does occur in many of our institutions.
Thank you so much. I have one final question. And so this question was posed that as an African-American working in healthcare, I've seen far too many times non-diverse hires that were strongly based off groupthink and cultural biases such as Asians are better biostatisticians versus non-Asians. Is there a push in HR culture to really address the lack of diversity in hiring, especially when no one in the C-suite of healthcare organizations reflect the diversity of the organization?
I think that kind of goes into the informal good old boy, good old girls network that we were talking about, with how a lot of these positions are filled in some organizations prior to the search. The search is just a procedural process where rubber stamped individuals are being put into these programs. And as I stated, if the recruitment team is not diverse, chances are you're not going to find yourself in a diverse organization. I do think a lot of websites of organizations do have the pictures of those in leadership. If you do not see a diverse workforce in leadership at an organization, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, that may be something you may want to question. If everyone looks the same at this organization, do I truly have a shot, of progressing my career here? And, I think this is something that we all have to make sure that we plant ourselves in organizations where we can thrive. And there are some people, some organizations that do a lot of talking, but when we look at what the results are, there are no results. There's no there. There's the emperor with no clothes, for lack of another phrase to say. And so I do think when you sit on these committees, if you're a part of these committees, you have to speak up, because that's the only way it's going to change. Is that, when you see things that are being discussed and candidates are being overlooked for various reasons, that really becomes problematic. I know we're going to talk about credentialing bias and things of that nature, but I have been on committees where I have seen people disqualified for things that made absolutely no sense. It's like saying someone's experience is not recent enough. You could have had a person that suffered a major health scare in their life, or maybe they had to take care of a spouse, a partner, a child, and they were unable to work for a couple of years. And so now you're discriminating against them because they're not currently in the workforce. That is problematic, but that is something that happens all the time. The questions we should ask is this person, do they have the skills to do the job? One of the things that I also would like to highlight, and I think it's important that we discuss, is transferable skills. Sometimes we overlook candidates for positions because they have not been in that position before, but they can bring transferable skills from other industries and other areas and they can be major assets to our institutions. But if we neglect them because of the transferable, we do not see the benefit in the transferable skills, that's also problematic.
Thank you so much for your contribution. I want to also add that as a person of color or a minority or an underrepresented group, when you have a seat at the table, it's really important to utilize your voice to speak for those that are not there. That is how you begin to make an impact, and that is how you begin to force diversity when there isn't any. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Carter. Kairi, we're going to move on to you.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, Nakura colleagues. Special thank you to the organizers, Latasha and Megan, to my co-presenter, Dr. Carter, Rashonda, thank you for moderating as well as for the introduction. As Rashonda noted, I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research Administration and Compliance for the University of California, Berkeley. And in that role, I oversee our sponsor projects office and all the various research compliance area from human animal stem cell to conflict of interest export controls. I'm really pleased to be here today, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you a little bit about my own thoughts on these topics, and not necessarily from my institution, although I think they would be supportive of some of the things that I'm going to say. So I'm here to talk a little bit about establishing required and preferred requirements when hiring, and ultimately, are they a benefit or a restriction to hiring diverse talent? So I think, as we all know, job postings are necessary for defining responsibilities, also necessary for determining various positions and pay scales, so forth, relative to the job that needs to be done. We've all seen these requirements ourselves, right? Likely in the roles that we are in, right? Needed to have those requirements or some set of those requirements to be eligible for the job, be considered, for the job. Also, you may have, in some case, I know there's some folks who are also hiring managers. So in this case, you may have also had the responsibility and the opportunity to set what those requirements are. Interestingly enough, the hiring process is, by nature is an exclusionary one, right? And, how do you get from casting a wide net of several potential applicants, right, getting down to ultimately 2 finalists and/or, that candidate you want to provide an offer to? But along that hiring journey, right, we have to make good faith efforts to hire with diversity in mind. And a key challenge when we think about requirements, is that, each employer and also then the individual hiring managers all place different weights on these requirements and skills that they might want to see in a candidate, and based on what they believe are necessary to get the job done. And I think therein lies the problem when you're thinking about inclusive hiring, because it has ability for our natural kind of human biases to come in. So let's explore this a little bit more.
And now we have the results of the poll. You want to talk a little bit about the poll results?
And so we're looking at years of higher education experience, looking pretty consistent across the board in terms of our representation, of 1 to 5, 6 to 10, and 11 to 15, all around 20%. 16 to 20 years, we got 17%. And then there are at least 17% of us that's more than 20 years. So a good mix of folks within the different stages of their career. All right, so let's get into this a little bit, and let's make sure we start from a baseline. We go to the next slide. What are these, required qualifications we're talking about? And I think we all know what those are, right? The minimum requirements that are part of that job description to ensure that employees, who perform similar work and have the necessary skills and are compensated fairly, right? And then that's the intent. Minimum requirements generally set that baseline education, experience, and other potential skills that might be essential in doing the job. However, minimum qualifications do more than just establish your classification and compensation system, right? They're intended to create objective means for narrowing the candidates And in that objectivity, right, there is some issue for bias that we'll get to later. Next slide. We have preferred qualifications, right? So, hey, you have your set qualifications, you need to have this experience, this education, and then in those job descriptions, you might see some preferred qualification. And those, generally, are not required, but considered to be considered for candidates in those positions, right? They're desired, if you will, qualifications beyond those standard requirements. Next slide. And just some examples of requiring for, again, we've seen these, right? And to summarize a bit, or at least how many folks see it, right? Required generally means you better have this, or maybe I shouldn't apply, right? Or often that's how a lot of folks take it. Preferred often is read as, we'd really like it if you knew how to do this also, right? And in some institutions, they might even enter what's called desired skills, right? Which I like to translate to, it'd be really cool if you knew about this, right? So we're familiar with these different types of minimum and preferred qualifications. We've seen them in our own job descriptions for jobs we hold, as well as jobs that we're hiring for. Yet two of the most significant requirements, right, or ones that are often the key topic of conversation, right, when you're looking at candidates and trying to select your pool, is education and experience.
And so I have a question for you, Kairi, before we go to the are these realistic? Are the preferred ones realistic in terms of the required? And is that why they are listed as preferred? And if they are realistic, does that make a candidate more competitive if they have the preferred versus just the required?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, because often I believe preferred often, particularly, and even myself, as I've kind of grown and had to think through this process, reflect on past hirings and such. Preferred generally is often not necessarily realistic, right? If the minimum sets, here's what you need to do the job, right? Then adding in this additional criteria, right? While it may be good to say, oh man, if this person also did this, man, we hit a home run here. It also often has an opposite effect of then becoming disclusionary, and potentially could be losing out on talents who say, well, man, only they're likely not going to give me the job because I don't have that preferred, right? Even though I meet all the required. So I do believe that they are, in hindsight, of even positions that I've hired for, often an area that we really need to assess to say, do we really need to outline this, and is it necessary to do the job? Are these preferred skills things they could learn while they're here? Which part of our job back to our employees is also continuing that education and growth, right? So not getting it where, too often, do we want to hire a position and say we want to get someone who matches who just left that position, right? Maybe they were in the role for 12 years. So I want to hire someone with 12 years experience so we can keep that rolling, right? We can keep things moving. And sometimes when you take that opportunity on how we could maybe, go with someone less experienced, because we also believe that we could train them to be what that 12-year person was. So long-winded questions. I think they're unrealistic. Let me know if I missed a part of your question.
No, great answer. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
And so while we're looking at the poll question, Kairi is going to expound a little bit more on why we're looking at what degrees as it relates to the required versus preferred. Kairi?
Absolutely. Experience and education, often we want to, which is more important? What do employers believe are more important? And I think we can all agree on the benefits and merits of education and experience. But does that higher degree get your foot in the door, right? Or does that past work experience, count for more? As we look at, we talked earlier, mentioned about starting that hiring process, about casting a wide net, right? It's really the start of that process. And, if educational degrees are not realistic, meaning that, is it really true that someone without that degree could not do this job? Then you starting your process already exclusion, right? Being exclusionary, not including potential talent that could be. you know, that could continue to still do well in the role.
Now we
And
have
from the poll, it looks like we have about 36% have bachelor's, 3% master's, and we also even have some doctorates in there as well, and some associates. So it definitely is a mix, you know, which we want to see. So I think diversity also in education is also important as well. But as I mentioned, you know, we understand the benefits of education experience kind of on their own merit, right? There is, you know, something there to the hiring process that could be beneficial there. I think where we potentially can get in trouble is how we are actually, as hiring managers, as institutions, setting those potential degree requirements, right? You know, to, you know, we talked about higher education, right? So often, sometimes in higher education, it seems that if you work in higher education, you should also, right, hold such degree in such positions, right? But, you know, have we ever really went back and questioned, you know, do we really need that, right? And is there, and, you know, could that person be successful without that degree? And as universities, we also have the unique opportunity of allowing our staff to go back to school and give them those things. So, so for the next slide, sorry. You know, which is more important? You know, it depends. You know, it depends on the type of job, and it also depends on the hiring person or committee's preferences along the way, in terms of which is more important. But, you know, some universities try to provide guidance, not to lean on one or the other, but it really comes down to that hiring manager and their committee's preferences. I tried to also find, you know, in preparation for this discussion today, you know, some statistics out there, and they seem to be a little bit all over the place. We say this is definitely a tough question to tackle or to gain good information, or, you know, is the survey in itself biased? Because if I'm asked that question, am I willing to really self-reflect if that self-reflection might seem as a negative, right? So I think we, you know, so that one I recognize, you know, even in this, hey, this is a tough one to answer, you know, when thinking about inclusive hires. So next slide. So as I mentioned, you know, I saw many different surveys out there. You know, from my kind of own experience and just reflecting kind of in academia and university, you know, it seems like often the conversation did revolve around, well, what type of experience did this person have? You know, do they have transferable skills and so forth? And you know, some professions demand a certain level of education just as an entry requirement. So, you know, for example, you know, things in sales might be more results driven, you know, as opposed to education. And there are many industries who follow in that model. You know, yet there's others where, you know, just to break entry, you need to have certain degrees. But I did find one study from Harvard Business School that, you know, mentioned 30% of employers ranked experience as the most important qualifications in an applicant. And then that grew a little bit in organizations who had 10,000 or more employees. They thought experience was more important than a degree 44% of the time. Excuse me. You know, is there a right or right answer to that question? You know, we'll see. Next slide.
Well, actually, before we go to the next slide, I have a question for you, Kairi. Have you ever hired a candidate based on the preferred versus the requirements? And if so, why?
Yes. So I have. I think I reflected, you know, once I was hiring for a director, I think it was a director of compliance. A lot of their, at a previous institution, a lot of their focus of their responsibility, you know, included export controls and agreements and those things. And I'm pretty sure that job description said, you know, JD preferred or JD something, right? It wasn't required to be a JD, right? But it was in there. And I thought about this as I was preparing for this discussion today. And in that case, now the person we ended up hiring didn't have a JD, but that was an area where I thought back, like, yes, we did include that, right? Often because, you know, some of this compliance and export stuff does have a legal twist to it. So that was kind of our reasoning. But I think thinking, you know, that was pretty about, you know, 4 years ago or so. And if I think about now, as well as the conversations around inclusive hiring and those things and learn, you know, I was like, you know, I can definitely learn from that past one. So I've definitely been guilty of that in the past.
And so, to your point that you also made, as we are in institutions of higher education, we often see leaders who are hired that don't have the education. As you mentioned, a JD was required, but the person did not have a JD. So how do you justify requiring education, but also still hiring without that qualification being met?
Yeah, I think it's, again, I think, when you think back and look at it, hey, this person needs to be able to do these things, and it'd be good if they had this too. And the good to have this too, I think, is what's often a way to, help you decide between your finalists, right? Hey, I got 3 good folks, they're all good, I think they could work here. Maybe we should lean toward the one with a preferred. And that's not really the right way to go about it in those cases.
Thank you.
So what about education? Right, so if, let's say 44% folks thought experience, right? The other half of that, right, really thinks, education might be more important. But then that's also another area, that helps reduce our diverse candidates, right? I was able to find a quick study that showed that, focusing on degrees only, right, eliminates most minorities, right? Now, let you guys check out the certain percentages, but that reduces the pool. So if you have a initial strategy of hiring diverse, really evaluating those degree requirements will be critical to determine your applicant pool and how diverse it might be. Because at the start, you might be eliminating potentially good talent who may not have had the opportunity of education and so forth. So how do education experience, do they create inequalities? Absolutely. The arguments for, higher education versus work experience, they vary, and they're also full of bias. Obtaining a higher degree, right? Some might believe only proves that you can succeed in academia, but not the real world, right? That's a bias, right? That is not actuality. Work experience can make you a good match for a particular job, right? But without higher education, somehow you might lack the skills critical to that role, right? Not sure how much we want to believe that as well. And a degree might show that you have special knowledge or technical skills that employer is looking for, but can that be transferred to the workplace? And, in those and answering and looking at those, is where we see, a lot of inequities within the hiring place set by these various requirements, whether they be minimum or preferred.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
And the question is, what does the completion of a degree really mean in the workforce generally? If not providing technical skills outside of those situations, what is learned that cannot be learned on the job with training?
Yeah, I think there's not much, if you will. I mean, I think there are a lot of folks, and trust me, I have them, as friends and in my families. I think, while I'm absolutely proud of my degree, I don't think that, in many senses that somehow it gave me more or less skills, or someone couldn't also be just as successful. I think, again, hiring is an exclusionary process, right, by its nature that it's built. So it's a way to kind of set the way that maybe, or historically, to make sure the net wasn't too wide, or, that, going to school shows a certain level of commitment, or through group projects, I know how to collaborate and those things, but those aren't the only experiences one could have in their life, you're right, to draw some of that same growth. So there could be others who do, other things, whether it be, volunteering in their community and leading different initiatives. So there's many different ways, I think, to show those. So I do think, this represents a huge area for organizations to take a look at those requirements. And I think, in fact, some of the, more big industry places are actually leaning more towards removing degrees. So, the Apples and Googles of the world, really going to get their talent and saying whether or not they get to do that particular degree, right, doesn't impact the coding that the coding skills these individuals were able to build and then can translate over into Google. So I think, I think that was a historical, way in a process in hiring that we need to reevaluate relative to the actual job and what needs to be done.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, in evaluating experience versus education, setting those educational degrees and such, right? They do create bias, from institutional bias, from adding advanced degrees and desired qualifications that we spoke about with their, or applicants within knows your system, right? I've seen that one. It's like, oh, they're good, but they don't know how to use our financial system, or they've never used our research administration system. Explicit bias, when reviewing resumes, right? Are we intentionally, only looking at certain candidates who may have graduated, from a certain school or a certain school of prestige that resonates with them? And then, despite those two, you still, along the full process, need to worry about implicit bias to ensure that it's fair and equitable hiring process and be able to detect those biases along the way and self-correct. Next slide. So what are some tips for recruiting diverse staff? I mean, I think this is a start. In no way does this solve the larger problem. I think this is what we're doing today in terms of raising and continuing to discuss these issues is what we need to do. But it starts with an organizational commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's not just an organizational statement, right? Or a nice brochure with myself on the cover. It's a true commitment through actions. When you're setting out you're setting your process to hire, right? Developing job criteria, that's really at the center of the role, because it lays the foundation for an equitable search. As we talked earlier, right, Dr. Carter, about strategizing up front, with your hiring team, with the folks involved building the job description, including those that are diverse. You want to write position descriptions that are inclusive, right? You want to reevaluate the education requirements. Is that necessary to do this job? All right, and are there applicants out there that could do this job that maybe don't have that application? And are we kind of, self-cannibalizing our ability to have a more diverse pool? Next slide. One I also missed is you need to have diverse search committees. Your full search committee also should be diverse, as your hiring strategy team or the folks, helping you build the position. One thing that I liked as I transitioned from my previous job to Berkeley is, within a month I had to hire a position, and HR reached out and says, okay, Kairi, all your search committee, must be diverse. Please send us all the names of everyone. And also, every person on the search committee needs to take these 2 trainings, one on implicit bias, another one on best practice in hiring that covers some of these things. That at that moment was like, man, this is good. And through that training, I had a lot of positive conversations with not only those search committees, but even some of my direct reports who are embarking on their own hiring, to really have us reevaluate some of these tips to ensure our process is as inclusive as it can be. But you also want to distribute the job posting widely, right? If you're able to set reasonable criteria and requirement, then you want to distribute that posting widely so it can get to a wide set of network. Right? Consider attending professional network events like Nakura puts on, right, where you can share this need. A lot of folks do that and leverage Nakura's pipeline to ensure we're getting out to a diverse group, to a diverse group of applicants. Next slide. When screening applications, right, we have to, along with your diverse committee, hold each other accountable. Resist comparing candidates to one another. It's about what they do, the job and that candidate. We want to, not make assumptions, right, about the motivations that they have for applying for the job, right? Hey, I think they really just want to get a promotion at the place they're at, right? So that you don't take them serious or what have you. We have to try to do our best to not make assumptions along the way. And ultimately be aware of your personal biases and stereotypes. As a minority, I can't say that I'm an expert in all diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging issues, and continue to learn along the way. And I think a big part of it is being willing to have that self-reflection to say, you know what, now that I've understand this, or we've had more conversations around this, be able to reflect in the past and say, I might have did that differently now with this conversation. And I think that's how we continue to push things forward. I also know that there was a lot of individuals who potentially aren't yet in their career where they have hired or going to embark on their own hiring process. So with respect to looking at education and experience criteria, don't feel you always have to meet 100% of what's listed there, right? And put yourself forward. Many of us do say, you know what, I don't have that one thing, so I'm not going to apply, right? So one of my personal recommendations is, like, absolutely, if you meet the majority, you should be able to go to still apply for that as well. Next slide.
Actually, Kairi, I have a question for you that relates to this slide, and we are right at the questions and answers section, so this is perfect. What's wrong with bias in hiring? And we have a history of hiring friends in this industry. What's the impact of continuing to do that, and why is this such a problem?
Yeah, I think hiring friends is definitely an issue, not only just from a conflict of interest, not only from it truly kind of misrepresents the hiring process, or the ability to say we're going to go out and seek the best candidate. You kind of already knew what you were doing, so there's a lot of work that goes in these hiring processes as well. And I see that as a problem, because you also then create within the organization, you can also create different siloed groups, if you will, right? This is part of my internal crew or team, if you will, versus everyone else. It also eliminates the ability to really have a fair and equitable hiring process. These need to be, these positions need to be filled with those who are best to fill that position. And if you have a friend who has that skill sets, right, they should be able to apply, and they need to be able to go through the same, process, if you will. Also, in those cases, I believe the hiring manager, when conflicted, should step up and say so, right? So that the whole group knows that, hey, I do have a potential relationship with this person, or I've worked with this person before, or what have you. So that as we're thinking about and deciding on who's moving to the next round, who's our finalists, and those things, that we're doing so, fair, transparently, and equitably. I also just believe, I'll personally say is I have too much responsibility to just do a favor to a friend. That's real work that got to get done. So I would avoid that at all costs for anyone thinking that. But it is something that happens, and we can continue to push forward. And I think organizations who hold their hiring managers accountable to a process that then is also reconciled, show us how you got to this final decision, and those things, definitely helps.
I couldn't agree more. And Dr. Carter, would you weigh in, please? Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes, if you can repeat the question.
Sure. So what's wrong with bias in hiring? We have a history of hiring our friends in this industry, and what's the impact of continuing to do that, and why is that such a problem?
I think if you're really looking at your friend, are you truly being objective in the recruitment process? I think it's very difficult for someone to truly give their friends the harsh feedback, because you're going into that interview already having a positive view of that individual. So your bias going into the process. And so if it was me, I would have excluded myself from the interview if it was a friend whom I was interviewing, to make sure that the process is fair. Not everyone is me. There are people who, as we were talking about with the informal recruiting processes that tend to let their friends know of a position before the position is even come available. And if they know it, they already got a heads up on the process. So, while you're just preparing because you saw it on the website and you want to make sure you get your packet together, they probably already had 4 months head start of getting their materials together.
I definitely agree. And as we move to the next slide, I have some questions that I've prepared for you all. We're going to move forward with credentialing bias, which will be an open discussion where I will ask a couple questions, some that have come in from you all and some that are prepared to discuss with the panelists. And so I'm going to begin first with the questions that were submitted from our viewers. And so the first thing was more of a comment, and I just want to read the statement. And it says that it's one thing to have a diverse hiring committee. However, those committee members should receive training and understand how their biases drive their perspectives and can interfere with the hiring process. And I think you both covered that tremendously in what your feedback that you provided. And so I wanted to just add that point. But to the next part of this question, where I would like both of you to weigh in, is that what are the best strategies to retain diverse employees to help them feel safe, valued, and welcome, and foster an inclusive workplace? Either one of you can go.
I guess I can go first. I have been at some places where I was hired and I was really like the token person of color on the leadership team. And it can be very alienating with the comments that you will hear in certain discussions where you are having to defend your people, defend your belief patterns. It can be very taxing. And one of the things I think is also critical is to get to a point where you can be authentically you, whatever that may be. And I recall early in my career, because, my parents named me Jamail. It's a very ethnic name. And I recall there was a period in my life where on my resume, I went by my first two initials, JD, just so on the surface, people were not biased against my name. And I remember getting an interview at this place, and they talk about ghosted me. They ghosted me for like 3 months after the interview, and I kept sending emails as to what is going on, why haven't I heard back? And then eventually the offer came. But the climate at that particular organization was very, very toxic. And it really started with the leadership team there at that particular organization, where they were not friendly to people of color. And I guess if you looked around the dynamics of the people in the office, there were really no people of color that worked there. But I say that to say, getting back to my story, I remember when the guy who was my supervisor at the time was calling me. He kept calling JD. And that is not how people who I communicate with communicate. They don't call me JD. And so he was like, did you not hear me? But it was one of those things where I was inauthentically not this JD person, which was this character that I was fulfilling because I was in a climate that didn't really embrace diversity. And I think we have to make sure that we allow our employees, our direct reports, to be authentically themselves, even though it may not be a person or a name we quite understand. But when a person can be authentically themselves, that's when I think you get the benefits that come with diversity in your workforce.
Thank you, Dr.
I agree. And it really aids to really kind of creating the right environment, right? Where, you can be authentic, create opportunities to discuss issues that might be sensitive to them, show them you care, right? And in terms of retaining diverse talent, right? Be honest about where you are. Don't sell them in terms of where you might be starting off on your, on your journey for more inclusivity. and then not, actually do the things that you say you're going to do, and deliver those. I think, you might not in your role be able to solve all those issues, but I think, with retaining diverse talent, knowing that they have someone to go to, someone that has their back, and that in their unit themselves, they feel and see value or feel valued, here. So I can totally agree with many parts of that. With while it is a good thing to get in the roles that Dr. Carter and myself have, and be able to give back to these things, it is often still a battle upward, in terms of seeing other folks like us, and still trying to navigate navigate these issues. I come into Berkeley, during my interviews, I had to give my diversity statement, they asked me questions, right? And in my particular unit, they say, well, what's your plan? Let me turn the question back on you, right? And they're kind of, where their strategy, or the folks from the chancellor's office or people's and culture's office, right, a little bit ahead of the game, more than maybe my office was. And I didn't at that point see it as totally like, maybe this isn't for me. I saw it more as, hey, it's an opportunity for me to help change there, and push the narrative, and hopefully allow the more retaining of diverse talent just like myself.
Thank you so much. Briefly, I just want to give an introduction of what credential bias is. And basically, it is when a person is perceived to be underqualified or overqualified. Oftentimes, it is those who are from underrepresented groups where they have attended HBCUs or not predominantly PWI institutions. And so one of the things that we have as a perfect segue to this to this comment, that I would like just both of you to give your perspectives on before we wrap this up, is that someone noted that I've encountered many times a candidate was devalued because the degree came from a HBCU or a HSI. Should degree institutions be unidentified to prevent this type of hiring bias? And since Dr. Carter, since you went first, I'd like Kairi to go first, and you can bring us home.
Gotcha. So, sorry, first part of the question, Rashonda?
Sure. The question, the question said that they've encountered many times that candidates were devalued because their degree came from a HBCU or a HSI. And should degree institutions be unidentified to prevent this type of hiring bias?
I think the short answer is probably yes, right? Particularly for those, the education section often, within our application systems, is the system itself kind of screens those criteria and those things. So even reflecting by my own, I'm like, how little I really look at what the school is, or somehow the school being somehow a determining factor. They have a degree, but it ain't this school or what have you. Myself went to a small school after starting out first initially at an HBCU at Delaware State, and then over to Widener University, which was a small, private school that not many folks know about outside of Philadelphia. That's definitely a concern. And I think the easy answer is yes. We have these systems. It could be de-identified from the hiring managers. All you need to know is that you have it or not. If that's truly a realistic requirement for that job, I can see that as a way to make these applicant pools more diverse, by doing that, and trying to, eliminate that particular, bias. I've also seen others, where, I have a master's degree, but the role is entry level, and it's like, well, they're masters, they're going to want my job in 2 years, right? So I've also seen it where, sometimes folks are overqualified or having a second degree, or somehow you won't be able to do the job, or because you may want to move on in 3 years or something, somehow that doesn't, represent a good hire. So we definitely have to try to protect against it, and I think that's one good idea that a lot of organizations should consider.
Thank you so much for the feedback. Dr. Carter.
I agree with Kairi on his faults, but I also think there are some other schools that I think some people tend to shun, and some of those are those that were catering to working adults, maybe your Phoenixes or things of that sort, where a person, because a lot of our bureaucratic, institutions were late in adopting online education until the pandemic, where they can really see the benefit and also got to see, oh, this is really what some students desire. There were people, I think, early on whom those degrees were also shunned upon. But I want to go to this overqualified situation where, some people will say, well, they will not fit in this job. Speaking as an industrial organizational psychologist, I would say if you go with an overqualified individual who may not be there past 3-4 years, if they are qualified, chances are if you give them the job in that short period of time with you, they will probably do more than someone who was not, at their level. And so I really think it's really how we frame when we look at the candidate pool, because we do not know why that person with a master's degree may be applying for the entry level position. It could be, they went to school and went from K to master's degree, never had any work experience. And so if they're trying to get some jobs that, require a master's degree, but they don't have any work experience, well, they're not going to get the job. And so that reminds me of a situation where I was on a committee and we had an individual who applied and, there was no work experience whatsoever, but they had the master's degree, and we thought it was a joke. But then when we looked at the application, then we looked at the resume, we saw, wait, they went to school all this time and did not have the work experience. So, just because a person has the master's degree, they may need to get the work experience and give them a shot, give them an opportunity. I think that's the best way we can approach it. And I will say, if you do have an opportunity to mentor someone who is in school, tell them to go and get an internship, go and get work experience. I think we can't go wrong mentoring young people that may cross our path while we're on these institutions.
Thank you both. I also just wanted to add that as a hiring official myself, I did a process where I de-identified candidates for before I brought them in. And what I would do is I would take anything that was possibly remotely identifying a candidate in terms of gender, in terms of area of location, in terms of education, even years of experience. I took all of that off the resumes just so that we would have a more holistic look at being diverse, and in doing so, we were definitely able to bring in more diverse candidates because, as you mentioned, Dr. Carter, some people definitely look at the type of school and say, well, this school is an online school. And before the pandemic, online schools were not as favorable as they are right now. And as Kairi mentioned, you may have people who are in a situation where they appear to be overqualified, but at any point in time, we can pick the jobs that we want to do. And so it should never be that I'm overqualified. If I was overqualified or I felt I was, I wouldn't apply for that job.
Right.
And I think those things need to be, weighed in, and we need to take our personal views off of applicants, because if somebody applied, give them the benefit of the doubt to be able to, be considered. Now, I know we are wrapping up, and I just wanted to ask one last question, and it's in terms of credential bias as well. I'm sorry, not so much as credential bias, but I know that we have a lot of role reversals in since the pandemic. We have moms that stay at home and we have dads that stay at home. And have you ever had any experience where you or someone that may have not applied for a position just because they thought they wouldn't be considered because they're a parent? Because in the past, I know that as a female, I would be apprehensive about doing so. But as a male, is that something you've ever encountered, or maybe your partners have ever encountered?
I think what I am seeing talking to some of my friends and acquaintances is that they have felt they were more productive being able to telework And I feel organizations that aren't embracing remote work are going to lose some of the best candidates available to industries and organizations that are embracing that benefit for staff. Because, you know, you're losing time, productivity when you're having to commute, be it a train or a car or however you're getting to work. And if you're in, you know, in California, you know, 15 minutes can add, you know, 2 hours to your commute, depending on what time you leave. So I think coming out of the pandemic, the work-life balance that being able to work remotely affords people is going to really be, I think, that edge that are going to separate many of our organizations and institutions from the ones that are in the bottom half of various industries.
Thank you, Dr. Carter.
Yeah, I would say absolutely, you know, whether it be, you know, family, friends, other colleagues, you know, but often, you know, from our female colleagues who often will have, you know, more of that worry in terms of, hey, I still got to manage the home, right? Is this job going to suit me? Are they going to be flexible enough to allow me to have that proper work-life, you know, balance? So, you know, I myself, because of, you know, being a man, haven't had that, but definitely expressed from folks that either work with or someone considering to apply for a position and those things, or maybe not yet a parent, but on their way to being a parent, and whether or not that's a good time to change their job if an opportunity presents itself. I think there's a lot of folks who don't present themselves to certain opportunities, right? Because, you know, they're with child, or you're getting ready to expand their family and those things, and unsure how that might look in the interview process, because there's a lot of you know, negative bias and judgment there as well. Like, this person's not going to be able to work for 3 months, right? Or whatever the case may be that impacted. So absolutely, I haven't felt it as much myself. I think just being a male, but it's definitely out there, something to aware of, and, you know, something I think, you know, understanding work-life balance is critically important. I think that's another way when you talk about retaining diverse talent, right? Is being able to have that work-life balance and let them do their thing. You know, right now, because I needed to be, right? I'm actually in Pennsylvania, right? But I work for Berkeley, it's on the West Coast, because I had a kid need and needed to be around. And I think having that flexibility, and folks understand you can get your work done, you know, wherever you need to, or get it done, or, you know, even with just remote work, it's not about, you know, am I working 9 to 5? Is that as important as what you're able to get done that day and get that work done however you scheduled it throughout the day? So I think, you know, really doing those things, but getting rid of some of these, you know, old issues that really prevent a lot of good candidates from moving forward, being promoted, or, you know, being selected as a finalist, or for them even putting themselves out there and feeling comfortable too. And I think one way, before you know, go through all the time for that application, is, you know, definitely look at, well, you know, while you won't understand everything about that organization, but what are they requiring their hiring managers to do, right? How do they hold them accountable, and those things? And those are also questions you could ask during the interview stage, because, you know, you're also interviewing that institution as much as they're interviewing you.
Thank you so much. And we have just a few minutes, and if we could quickly answer, how do you address the lack of diversity in an institution due to a high cost of living? Therefore, disadvantaged groups are likely to apply because they can't afford to live in that city.
Yeah, I can definitely take that, right? Being in the Bay Area, one of the most expensive places to live, I think that is an issue. But we've been benefited by remote work, and really embracing remote work to really be able to cast our net, you know, really wide, because that is a major issue. If you even think about last summer, where housing prices rocketed everywhere, right? You could only imagine in an area where the prices are already high. So I think, as Jamail mentioned, institutions who embrace that remote work, that allows them to cast a wider net to get more diverse talent who might not be able to afford to live in that particular state or area. But doesn't mean they still can't get the job done. So that's been a benefit for us. I think without, you know, without that, that would have been a major issue for us in that area. And I'm sure Jamail can relate very much.
Yeah, and then you have the opposite where there are some people that have affordable housing, but it's an institution that's in the middle of nowhere, and you only have one gas station and one road in and out. And you know, you bring people aboard, and they get in, and they're like, I gotta get out of here as quickly as I can. So I do think, you know, there are a diversity of problems, but I do think this is where affordable housing is something that is very important for institutions. And, you know, remote work allows for you to diversify your workforce. But then I think when you're looking at, you know, maybe having housing available for employees, if you're looking at perks and benefits that you can bring to your team, you know, that's something I think leadership teams should look at, because it is a war for talent. So how can you attract the best? That's something I think everyone in those decision-making positions need to think about.
Absolutely. So I just would like to thank my amazing colleagues for this program today, and thank you all for joining us in this conversation. It's been lively, and you have asked some great questions. And so we thank you for joining us today and hope that you've enjoyed the content.